Good afternoon, and welcome to the afternoon keynote intervention, Transitional Justice in Post-Revolutionary Egypt, by Dr. Khaled Fahmy. Dr. Khaled Fahmy is professor and chair of the Department of History at the American University of Cairo. He previously taught Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at New York University. His academic publications include Mehmet Ali, From Ottoman Governor to Ruler of Egypt, in 2009, All the Pasha's Men, Mehmet Ali Pasha, His Army, and the Founding of Modern Egypt, which was published in 1997 and has been an extremely important work for us historians who work on the history of the Middle East. It's been a groundbreaking work which really transformed many of the paradigms for the study of modern Middle Eastern history. Another book is The Body and Modernity, Essays in the History of Medicine and Law in Modern Egypt, published in 2004. After the revolution in Egypt started, he was appointed by the Minister of Culture to chair a committee to document it within the National Archives. And Khaled has done pioneering work in the archives, so it's quite the combination of his academic background as well as his work in connection with the revolution is extremely. I hope we will have a chance to talk about that at some point, Khaled. I know it's not the title of your talk. He also participated with civil society and human rights activists in drafting a new freedom of information law. And since May 2011, he's contributed to various weeklies and newspapers in Egypt and elsewhere. Please welcome Dr. Khaled Fahmy.
Thank you very much, Ahmed, and it's a great pleasure, honestly, to be here at AUB. This is my first time, believe it or not.
We tried to bring you before.
I know, it's not your fault, it's mine. But it's a real pleasure, and I'd like to thank and congratulate AUB for its new Asfari Center, wishing it success. I'd like to thank the provost and the organizers for putting together a wonderful and stimulating program, and and for bringing together a more wonderful constellation of scholars and friends, and giving me the opportunity to touch base with them and see them. I think I'd like to start maybe first by three apologetic notes, three disclaimers. One is that I'll be talking about Egypt. It's not because Egypt is Dunya, but I found myself in the midst of, of a revolution that is overwhelming and relentless. And frankly, I have very little time, honestly and ashamedly, to follow, let alone to think about developments elsewhere. It's a serious shortcoming, and this is one of the benefits of conferences like this, and so far I've really learned a lot in this one half day. The second is in a sense it follows from this, is that my paper will be mostly descriptive, I think, and short on analysis. I think one of the challenges, and we've been talking, Karima and I and Barbara, one of the challenges of this revolution and many other revolutions that are happening for people like us who are in the midst of it is that we are realizing, or at least I am realizing, and many of my friends, academics, we are realizing that the challenge that these revolutions pose to us as academics. We're realizing that our intellectual toolkits are not really enabling us to make sense of what is happening. When I take to the streets with my friends and my colleagues and members of my family, and people say, we've seen you on TV, you're an academic, you are a university professor, you're a historian, tell us. And I say, I don't know. I mean, there's nothing that I have studied that really enables me to make sense of this. I think this is unprecedented on many, many levels, not only on Egyptian level or even an Arab level, but a human level. And there's something that I've been humbled by. I mean, this revolution has humbled me in the sense that I think it is challenging us to come up with new ideas and new modes of analysis and new new techniques of thinking about social activity. This is not familiar terrain. There's something really, really new. And this is why Yazid's question earlier on, I think, is very apt. You know, what is happening in this particular village? What is I think description is what we need for the time being. I think it's too early to come up with overarching theories of, let alone predictions of what will happen. And finally, and to say how much I am looking forward to Karima's presentation tomorrow, is that I think really social sciences have failed us. And I think it is art that has captured the moment better than journalism or academia. I think it was in Egypt, it is poetry and photography and graffiti that are really way ahead in capturing the moment and in pushing it forward than anything that I have said, my friends have said, you know, in our pontifications on TV cameras and so on. When I listen to especially the poet I like most, Mustafa Ibrahim, I mean, he's it. I mean, he's way ahead of a lot of the poetry that preceded him, a lot of what we say in capturing something nebulous out there. With these three disclaimers, let me then say that my main question today is to try to explain why Egypt has failed to witness any serious process of transitional justice since the revolution. And let me explain, again, on a personal level. Again, Karim and I were just talking earlier. I went to Tahrir on the 25th of January and then 28th at serious risks, taking serious risks to my personal safety, like, you know, hundreds of thousands of other people. For me, it was the case of torture. That, for me, was the issue that motivated me, and that, for me, was the significance of the 25th of January as a date. This is Police Day. I wanted to go to humiliate the police on their day of joy and rejoice. I'm a historian. I study torture in 19th century Egypt. I study torture and I study forensics, and the connection between torture and forensics, in the sense, as we have seen with Khaled Said case, the emblematic case in the Egyptian Revolution, of how families of victims of torture have had recourse to forensic medicine to bring legal cases against strong men in the villages. I mean, this is my case in the 19th century. I've studied many, many cases in which a mother would insist on the autopsy of her son because this is the only way she could prove that he has died out of foul play. And this is as early as the 1850s. So that's why when Khaled Said happened, I said, no, that is significant on a personal level. And that is why when I received SMSs from my friends, and I was working in the States at that time, saying, come back home, something is happening, I understood that this is very serious. So let me start with a case that I have been following from before the revolution. It's a case that happened in 2007 of a young boy, 12 years old, in a small village called Shaha in Mansoura in the Delta, who stole a matchbox, literally, from the shack of a Ba'al, in his village. He was arrested by the police, and in police custody, they beat him. They kicked him with their boots in his stomach. He's a small, frail boy. He started a hemorrhage. They didn't know what to do with him, so they sent him to the local hospital, and the hospital said no, so they sent him back. And the police, apparently not knowing what to do with him, they literally dumped him in a van, in one of these service taxis that shuttle between provincial towns. And he was dumped in a nearby village. But then some people knew him and took him back to his mother. By that time, a journalist had caught wind of the case, and they went there and they actually videotaped him while he was dying. The mother, who's an illiterate 30-year-old peasant woman, insisted on an autopsy. because the police had ordered a clandestine surreptitious burial to avoid the funeral. So they buried the body at night. She managed to finally force the prosecutor to exhume the body and to conduct an autopsy, but the autopsy report, as we know, because of the complicity of the forensic department in Egypt with the police, came up exonerating the doctors, the officers, and saying this was a result of pneumonia. She filed a legal appeal, she lost it, and then she appealed personally to the president, Mubarak, and she lost it. I've been following this case because people have been writing about it, and since 2007, I wrote about it. So when the revolution happened, I was waiting for the time, for the day in which this case and many other cases would be reopened. This obviously is not the only case. There are many, many undocumented cases, and there are, the Egyptian Organization for Human Rights has documented 204 cases of death in police custody in the 10-year period before the revolution. There are, of course, other periods, and this does not count the ferocious, effectively civil war that Egypt had had in the 90s against Islamists, in which many Islamists also died in police custody. And we're not also talking about other torture cases that did not result in death. So torture in Egypt was endemic and continues to be endemic, and torture in police stations. And I was waiting for the time in which this phenomenon, in which Muhammad's mother, that's Muhammad Mamdouh, that's his name, would have her day in court. Nothing has happened. Again, torture is not an epiphenomenon. Torture is at the very heart of this revolution, and it has many causes and many facets. At the core of which is a legal, historically, torture in Egypt became so widespread in the mid-90s when Egyptian society, like American society, turned a blind eye to what the government was doing to the Islamists, and effectively gave the police force the green light to go after the Islamists at whatever cost. And we passed laws and legislation, our terrorism laws in Parliament, to make this possible. More specifically, these laws defined torture very narrowly and made it very difficult for torture to be prosecuted. The torture in the Egyptian criminal code has to, for a case to be qualify as torture, in which case, if it results in death, it actually is dealt with as if it's homicide. In other words, there's capital punishment for it. But it's a very narrow definition of torture. It has to be in police custody, conducted by a uniformed police officer, for the purposes of extracting confession from a defendant in a pending legal case. Now, many cases of torture are done outside or in illegal places of custody, and not by uniformed officers, and not in pending legal cases, and most importantly, not for the purposes of extracting confession, like Muhammad's case. So torture legally is defined very, very narrowly, and at the same time, it prevents the law prevents citizens from filing cases of torture. You present a petition to the prosecutor, and then the prosecutor general investigates the case and then initiates legal action. So human rights activists have been working on this and many other things to identify what makes torture so endemic. There are many things, but this is on the legal front. This is what they've been agitating for. Again, I've been waiting for a new law to define torture in a new way, and for somebody like Muhammad's mother to be able to finally bring to justice the people who've killed her son. But None of this has happened. And of course, the other package of what we mean by transitional justice. Most importantly, the putting to end immediately continuing torture cases and police brutality, acknowledging the suffering of victims financially and morally, and bringing to justice people who were perpetrators of these atrocities, and achieving some kind of societal closure. And it takes various forms, and I'm sure you're familiar with the different models from South Africa to Morocco to Eastern Europe to Latin America, different models. But curiously, this is again completely absent from the post-revolutionary discourse in Egypt. We did have cases, legal cases, the last of which was yesterday, in which 29 police defendants were acquitted for killing demonstrators during the 18 days in a northern neighborhood in Cairo, El Mark. This is the 25th or 26th case of acquittal. But of all of these cases are legal cases, are cases of police brutality and army brutality during the 18 days. It's after the downfall of Mubarak, not before. Also, we've had a limited number of cases in which the previous Minister of Interior was accused of course, he's now behind bars for serving 25 years for what he had done on the during the 18 days, in what I think is a botched up trial. And I think on appeal he will win. But there were other trials in which he was that were brought against him, but these were financial mismanagement. Specifically had to do with one case that went on for many years, many months. It was about the mismanagement of the misappropriation of public funds regarding metal plates of passenger cars, in which he had somehow benefited. It's not what we were waiting for. We're waiting for cases of torture, not cases of metal plates and embezzlement. And this is happening while there's, the human rights organizations are insisting on the importance of not only putting an end to torture, but on a complete restructuring of the security sector. And there are many proposals that have been put to the SCAF government, the military government, and then to the Muslim Brotherhood government to tell them that there are ways to do this. We can start with changing the uniforms, to changing the laws, to changing the way the police academy is run along military lines, to putting on trial people who are accused of police officers accused of police brutality and torture. All these calls have fallen on deaf ears. Now, with SCAF, we kind of understood. We were fighting SCAF, the military. And the military has been deeply implicated in atrocious examples during the 18 days, let alone before. But we had hoped that with a democratically elected government, regardless of what it is, that they would take seriously these prior cases. And I personally, and many people, were particularly keen on or expectant of the Muslim Brotherhood itself, the victim for decades of police brutality, of torture, to take this question seriously and to tackle it head on and to put it as the head of their priorities. And instead, none of this has happened. No opening of old files, no restructuring of the security sector, no stopping of police brutality, no conviction of police officers for past cases of torture. There's no acknowledgement of the suffering of the victims of torture. And after much pressure, as to fulfill one of his election campaign promises, President Morsi, actually soon after he assumed power, established a fact-finding mission, again, not about things that were done before the revolution, but during the 18 days and up to the handover to civilian government. And the fact-finding commission worked in secret for months, reached its conclusion, put the report, sent it to his office, and he did nothing until local Egyptian papers and then the Guardian newspaper started leaking the findings, and they were shocking of what the army has done and what the police have done, again, during the 18 days. And till today, there is no legal action being built on the findings of the commission that he established, formed by senior judges, human rights activists, representatives of the victims, basically of disappeared. Now, this is something that people don't know, but Egypt has a phenomenon of disappeared. It's not only Latin American countries. And the disappeared are disappeared at the hands of, according to the leaked report, leaked portions of this report by the army. We can talk about this. I mean, horrible cases, the most serious of which is orders by military doctors to conduct, well, vivisections, effectively, to conduct operations with no anesthesia in military hospitals. There has been no investigations, no legal act follow-up based on these reports. Our constitution, which is a disgrace of a document, has no mention of transitional justice. There is a very short clause in the preamble saying that this is a revolution as a result. I mean, the constitution is a result of of the revolution of 25th of January, blah, blah, blah. Nothing very specific. The only specific thing is Article 232, which barred former leading figures of the National Democratic Party from political life. And I think this is a very telling exception, you know, that this is the only thing that they were concerned about, the Islamists, the drafters of the Constitution. The Constitution is drafted by the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafis, effectively. So instead, the questions of transitional justice in post-revolutionary regime has been silent, and the discourse of Islamists have been preoccupied and dominated by questions of identity, the Islamic identity and Sharia. For example, I mean, there are many, many examples I could cite, but the Salafis have made it clear that drafting a new law for Hizbah, that is the right to command good and prevent evil given to private citizens rather than to the prosecutor's office, is more important for them than dealing with torture cases committed during the previous regime. And it appeared that what concerns them is not putting a stop to the ongoing practice of torture or trying the perpetrators, as much as it is, quote, the absence of gallantry from Egyptian society. غياب الشهامة, as Yasser Burhami of the Da'wah movement, the Da'wah Salafiyya, professed in an infamous interview to a Shuru newspaper on the 27th of December 2012. So in order to restore الشهامة and in another context, rugula, manhood, to Egyptian society, the Salafis were very concerned to make it possible within the constitution for future legislation to be enacted to allow private citizens to initiate legal action against each other in cases of moral deviance, which is what Hizbah is about, than trying perpetrators of torture. However, 10 days ago, all of a sudden, Islamists started talking about transitional justice. In newspapers, on TV, I'm not sure, I'm trying to explain why. Three of the largest Islamist movements started talking about transitional justice, demanding its immediate implementation. The Salafis, Hisham Kamal, spokesman for the Salafi Front, Jabha Salafiyya, said that Mubarak should have been tried for all his crimes from the beginning of his regime and not only for killing protesters during the 18 days. The political consultant to the Al-Bina wa Tanmiya party, the Building and Development Party, which is the political wing of the Jama'ah al-Islamiyya that assassinated Sadat, Aboud al-Zumur and Tariq al-Zumur, said, and he's also, interestingly, a member in the National Council for Human Rights, this is Osama Rushdie, said that the council has set out to form a specialized committee for transitional justice. And the ruling party, the Freedom and Justice Party, the head of its parliamentary bloc, Saad Imara, said, quote, torture crimes are not subject to statute of limitations and we cannot limit retribution to the previous regime alone, interestingly, and not to its predecessors, even if they are no longer alive. He's talking about Nasser. He's saying, okay, it's not only the 18 days and we should include Mubarak, the 30 years, but what about what happened under Nasser? Shouldn't this also fall under transitional justice? Now, what is the secret for the Islamists' sudden interest in transitional justice? It seems to me that the concern over the possibility of the release of the toppled president, Mubarak, is an explanation for this sudden interest in his earlier crimes. As Al-Jama'ah al-Islamiyya's Osama Rushdie said, it is not fair and just or just that Mubarak be punished for his final moments in power and to ignore the crimes he had committed since 1981, particularly torture cases that were performed on many of the Islamists' youth. Unquote. It is in my mind as if the Islamists are becoming more and more apprehensive of the prospect that the judiciary, about which I will say more in a minute, might order the release of Mubarak, and are now realizing that the prosecution for his trial, for which he received 25 years, had prepared a bad case to begin with because the charges against him were limited to his actions during 18 days and ignored crimes committed during his 30-year rule. Now, while Islamists are to be thanked for such an awakening, regardless of how late this awakening came, there are two peculiar and worrying points in their sudden interest in transitional justice. The first is their narrow definition of it. Their successive statements over the past few days imply that they define it as vengeance, which is the interpretation that one detects in expressions like, quote, implementing transitional justice on Mubarak. And it's the proposition that I'm interested in. تطبيق العدالة الانتقالية على مبارك, which is what Al-Jama'ah al-Islamiyya has recently called for. In such a phrase, the term transitional justice appears synonymous with retribution, قصاص, or death penalty. تطبيق القصاص على مبارك. تطبيق العدالة الانتقالية على مبارك. In so doing, Islamists overlooking the other more noble goals of transitional justice, such as achieving societal reconciliation, compensating victims in material and non-material ways, and putting an end on the ongoing human rights violations. There is as for the second disturbing point, it is I think, their monopolization of the victim mentality or victim position while belittling the suffering of others. And I think it is the Muslim Brotherhood in particular that occupy the best position here. And this is why they insist on not ignoring the atrocities committed by previous regimes. And the longer quote by the head of the parliamentary bloc of the ruling party says the following, Saad Imara. There are many injustices and violations of human rights that had been committed under Egypt's previous rulers. Under late President Gamal Abdel Nasser, there were bogus trials and torture. And given that torture is not subject to a statute of limitations, wouldn't this mean that previous regimes, even if the president has passed away, can still and should still be held accountable? Or is retribution limited only to the regime against which this revolution erupted? Unquote. But in addition to these two problems concerning the Islamist understanding of transitional justice, namely the vengeful definition of it and their insistence that theirs is a bigger cross than everybody else's, what are the other deeper problems that have stood on the way of Egypt seeing a proper transition to justice. Now, I would like to conclude by saying there are two crucial factors that distinguish Egypt from other countries that have seen more serious processes or attempts of transitional justice. But before I do so, let me say that not only have we not seen any serious attempt to deal with past atrocities or to compensate victims, torture and death in police custody is continuing till today. And I mean, this is something that I follow again personally and closely, but it became too close to home when my driver's cousin was killed in police custody literally exactly a month ago, on the 24th of April. I have his picture, and I carry it with me in my wallet. I mean, it's a small picture. 19 years old. He had a skirmish in a clothes shop. The owner ordered the police to come. The police came. They beat him to death for no reason. For no reason, they beat him to death in the police station, and then later claimed that he had hanged himself. I can go into the details, but there's no way that you could have hanged himself. There's not even an investigation that was done. And I have a copy of his death certificate in which the cause of death is left empty, is blank. And when the body was sent, as a matter of course, to the Cairo morgue, he was out in 15 minutes with a report saying that this is a natural death. That he died out of hanging from his police cell. Now we have eyewitnesses who are afraid, but we managed to reach eyewitnesses. The 6 fellow prisoners in his cell who said that it was the police officer who hit him with a wooden stick on his head. Again, I can go into the details. His name is Wa'il Rushdi. Torture is continuing under President Morsi, not under President Gamal Abdel Nasser, today, as of this moment. So, by comparison to other countries, what is peculiar? This is what I want to conclude with. Some thoughts about why is it so difficult. I think, like other countries, it is very difficult to put an end to police brutality if it has become so endemic. Typically, what we see in cases of transitional justice or transition to democracy in Eastern Europe, in South Africa, in Latin America, in many places, is a classical dilemma. The old regime has not really fallen, and the new regime is not experienced. So we have this tension, the police officers who are used to torture are still in place. And the new regime is not yet adept and strong enough to take on this important portfolio. So they go bit by bit, piece by piece, in a piecemeal manner. I think the problem with Egypt, in addition to this problem, has something to do with the peculiar nature of an outcome of the revolution. Because in addition, in Egypt we are not confronted with a bipartisan or bipartite division between the old regime, what in Egypt we have now called el-Filul, the remnants of the old regime which really have not fallen, and the new regime which is still not strong enough to tackle all of these portfolios. Because in Egypt we actually have a tripartite division rather than a bipartite division. Because we have the old regime, the Fulul, that of course includes not only the NDP, but the police and the army and parts of the judiciary and the administration. The regime, it has not fallen. not completely. And then we have what I prefer to call the Tahrir crowd, which I don't really know what it consists of, but it's the Facebook generation, it is youth, it is the secularists, it's the feminists, it is also workers and it is students, and it is something that in my mind did not start in 2011, did not start on the 25th of January, did not start in 2003. I actually take it all the way back to 1811, but that's another lecture. But it's people who, as Abla was saying earlier, who are trying to claim the country for themselves and to say we are citizens, not subjects. And that has a long history. It did not start in January. And thirdly, we have the Islamists. Now the Islamists, and I can go on, they were the victims of the previous regime, it is true, but they were not the ones who called for this revolution. And all the way up to the 11th hour, they were saying, we do not want to topple the regime. We want to, and the Salafis have come out explicitly to tell their followers, the Salafi sheikhs, not to partake in politics and not to take to the streets and that it is haram to partake in this revolution. But it is the Salafis who ended up in power. So it's a very peculiar situation where we have a country and the political scene in particular divided between these three factions. And the paralysis that Egypt now witnesses, which explains the paralysis in the transitional justice, is precisely because none of these three factions is strong enough to establish its hegemony over the other two. And the Muslim Brotherhood in particular finds itself in this most peculiar situation whereby it is in power, but like all new regimes and all transitions to democracy movements, it has to face the Fulul, the old regime. But unlike these other cases, it also has to face Karima and I and the Tahrir crowd. There is a revolution that they did not launch, and it is not dissipating. Their easy way is to say, is to actually, and I think they are genuine in this, they actually do not see the revolution. When they see people taking to the streets, either in front of the presidential palace or indeed for people who call for transitional justice, they easily lump them as remnants of the old regime, paid, and that they don't see this third faction, except as people being in the pay of the Fulul. One last thought. So I think rather than take on the police, they know what needs to be done. They know what needs to be done with the police. They know what needs to be done by the army. But the problem with the Muslim Brotherhood is that they do not control these two agencies, and they don't have the means to force the revolutionary crowd to dissipate. And for the revolution, I mean, the only way they could deal with us is to have gallows in Tahrir. But they cannot. They don't have enough power to hang us. They just don't. They cannot. Objectively speaking, they cannot. So sadly, what we are seeing now is a beginning of, so not only are they not taking seriously calls for transitional justice, they are reaching compromises with the police and with the army, and deciding instead to direct their anger at the press and the judiciary. It's four agents, four aspects, four sectors that they do, crucial sectors that they do not control: the army, the police, the judiciary, and the press. And they decided to go after the press and the judiciary rather than what we consider to be the main problem, which is the police and the army. I think in this case, and of course, I'd like to, Yazid is here, I don't know whether he's here or not, but I think the Salafis are key, and I think maybe they will end up being the kingmakers, and maybe they will be the ones who can tip the balance in a different direction. So let me conclude by reading 2 paragraphs. I have tried to argue that the lack of a transitional justice in Egypt is the result not merely of the fact that the revolution has not succeeded completely, but of the peculiar form in which the revolution has fanned itself out, with the resulting tripartite division between the Tahrir crowd, the Fulul, and the Islamists. But I would also like to argue, especially in light of the earlier discussions we've had today, that insisting on transitional justice at this moment, that is, insisting on putting an end to human rights abuses, acknowledging suffering of victims of past atrocities, bringing those responsible of these atrocities to justice, this insistence on transitional justice, even if it is understood by some of us as part of a counter-revolutionary human rights discourse, when looked at from without, is in fact a very potent revolutionary tactic. Thank you very much.
You spoke about the revolutionary crowd as a single bloc, and you'll probably remember that after this presidential election, there was a debate, and people pointed out that some 40-ish% voted neither for the old regime candidates nor for the Islamist candidates, and that this represented a third bloc, which I guess more or less corresponds to what you're calling the revolutionary crowd. But is this crowd unified in any meaningful political way?
Thank you for your talk, Khaled. One observation and then one question. Retributive justice is part of transitional justice. You were sort of mentioning that it was separate. But I'm just wondering if you might draw, any kind of a comparative analysis with the transitions that occurred in Latin America, what we're seeing now in Guatemala with the, obviously genocide is different than torture, but it's a similar thing that Efrain Rios-Montt was convicted and then the conviction overturned. It just begs the question of the constituencies who seek justice for political crimes of previous regimes, and particularly in the case of the Islamists, whether they're analogous to like fascists in Spain, who have retained their refusal to think about any kind of justice, same as in Guatemala and so on. So would you compare the Islamists now in power to fascists elsewhere?
A footnote to say, AUB created the first minor in the world on transitional justice 5 years ago. So predict all these before the Islamists. Okay, so outside of this footnote, I think I think the way you describe the power now, how they implement the transitional justice, I would say déjà vu how Latin America, the first transitional government in Argentina, in Chile, particularly Bolivia, they did. It means that they, it's very vindictive. It's very prosecution, in fact, but in fact they did nothing. But there's a lot of talk about the prosecution. So I think I don't feel a lot of particularism of Egypt in this regard. And but what is really important, and this is my question to you, that it is to analyze not the motivation in terms of vindictive or not, but the interest of which group. Which group is this transitional justice survey? I mean, do we have a talk about reparation for who? Okay, and things like that.
Thank you, Khaled. Just linking up to the panel right before, where we were talking about the economic injustices and historic injustices, one often overlooked element of transitional justice is addressing historic injustices in economic and social terms. And for example, in South Africa, despite all the discussion about the successes of the Truth and Reconciliation committees there, one of their biggest failures is actually addressing historic injustices in terms of economic and social. And perhaps this is something that, with our focus in this part of the world on the human rights component, on the torture, which is very important and which is undermining social cohesion across the region, we're overlooking that fundamentally also important part. The addition to my question would be, where is the tremendous energy and the tremendous outburst of civic action that we have seen? What is their role? Civil society has a very important role to play in pushing and advocating for transitional justice, and we've seen this in very different contexts, from Argentina to Lebanon to different places. Even when the state enforces amnesia, civil society has played a very important role in keeping these issues alive and in pushing for an agenda even 20 years down the road. So where is the role of civil society in Egypt today on this? Thank you.
Joel, no, they're not unified. And it would be very unfair to expect them to be unified now. I mean, we've not had politics in Egypt for ever. And to expect these groups to be unified now is just unfair. The question is, what are they doing to address this question and to deal with the very important point you mentioned earlier, which is political party, hierarchical organization. And I'll tell you of a very interesting initiative that I'm part of, an initiative that tries to do exactly this. There are political parties that have been established, but they're vacuous. They're vacuous because people have not joined them the way they have joined other activities. And the initiative is precisely to do the following, to recognize that the past 20 years have affected an unprecedented and a very significant accumulation of talent, of skills in specifically human rights organizations. Now, we dismiss them because we would have liked to see more politically orthodox organizations. But this is where Egyptian youth who are politically conscious have put their energies. And in the process, they've accumulated a lot of talent and skills. And I think the question now is, how can we bridge the gap between them and political parties? And the initiative that I'm part of is to basically create a new civil society organization that would basically, to which will be outsourced the effort that the parties need to do. Well, parties don't have skills. So they don't have the energy or the time or the capacity to train their own leaders, activists, members. So the aim of this new organization is to build a bridge between human rights organizations that have been active for the past 20 years and these new parties. I think this is very creative. Does it belong somewhere else? I don't know. Does it fit in any particular pattern that we've studied in textbooks? I doubt it. But it is a result of this very creative energy and of capturing the moment and of saying, okay, let us build on our strengths and not necessarily transform these political human rights organizations into parties, but let us wed them with parties in terms of skills and talents and past experience. Lisa, I think, both the question by Sari and Lisa in terms of retribution and vengeful justice. Yes, I think I recognize this to be part of what is happening, and I'm not saying that they shouldn't, but I mean. This is part of this is what I gave you is as you know, is a translation of an article that I had written in Arabic aimed for another audience. So excuse me for that. And the audience is an Arab Egyptian audience, and I want to basically embarrass the Muslim Brotherhood. They should not assume the moral high ground. So this term, transitional justice, is not theirs. They want to use it, fine. But we will engage with them to tell them that your use of it is very parochial and very limited and very self-serving. And we, as human rights activists and members of civil society, have a much more noble, much wider much more serious understanding for society, not because we have read some manuals of human rights abroad, but because we want to achieve societal reconciliation. We have a much better recipe to do this than theirs. So that's my point. Yes, of course, people come with retribution. Okay, so admit that you are vengeful, admit that you are parochial, and admit that this is what your politics is all about, rather than assuming to be speaking for all victims of torture, rather than victims of torture under Abdel Nasser. And the last point about Maha's point, of course, yes, there is a social and economic justice dimension in it. But, I'll be very frank. The axe I had to grind personally was torture. It's part of my tradition, part of my background, part of my interest, and part of what I consider to be a very serious wound in Egyptian society. And yes, so my main point is that the amnesia that they are trying to establish needs to be undermined, and it is. And one of the most significant things about human rights activities in Egypt over the past 20 years is precisely to change the agenda. They have managed to put on the agenda questions that no one else was talking about. Not the ruling party and not the main opposition, which is the Islamist opposition. To put torture on the agenda and to make a revolution on the 25th of January, Police Day, to highlight this particular aspect. I think this is a very significant accomplishment.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.